righty, next let's talk about the European countries that emerge at the forefront of exploration. First is Portugal. Okay, even though Portugal is smaller than Spain, they were the first to start this whole age of exploration, right? Mostly due to the sponsorship by Prince Henry the Navigator. Okay, so he was the Prince of Portugal. Well, let me change that to blue. And in the midst of the Dark Ages, 1419, even before the Renaissance got kicked off, Prince Henry recognized that Europe was behind and that everywhere else had a golden age and that Europe had to catch up. So how do we catch up and become an empire? Well, we need trade. We need access to the most profitable trade. And at that time, that trade was in Asia, specifically the Indian Ocean routes. Now, what was in Asia that the Europeans wanted so badly? Okay, so gunpowder did culturally diffuse out of Asia through the Mongolian conquest, but that wasn't what they were mainly there to trade for. Specifically in Southeast Asia, good with the Spice Islands, the spice trade. So they desperately wanted those spices. Spices could be used to preserve food. They could be used as incense. They could be used as medicine. Okay, so there's a high demand for those spices. Now, Italy had a monopoly on the European access to Asian trade through the Mediterranean sea lanes. So they can't go through the Mediterranean Sea. And they also can't go through the Silk Road without the Muslims, namely the Ottoman empires, charging them a bunch of money for the right to use that trade route. And so he wants to find an all-water route, a maritime route, to Asia. And so with that, he starts a school for navigation where they take technology from the East in order to expand their knowledge base and build upon that technology for the goal of finding a maritime route. They take gunpowder, they take the compass, the lateen sails, the astrolabe, all of that maritime technology, and they bring it over to Europe. And so lateen sails in particular are going to be combined with square sails in Europe to create a new ship, the caravel. So that's an example of synchronism. You take the square sail of Europe, the lateen sail, which is triangular from China, combine them together to create something new, a new type of ship that is lighter and faster and better suited to traveling up and down the African coastline. So at first, Prince Henry the Navigator starts funding these expeditions along the coastline due to the export of gold in Africa. So at the very beginning, he's interested in gold. Then eventually he's going to develop a trading post empire along the coast of Africa to allow for explorers like Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama to find a route around Africa to Asia. Now, with that trading post empire, even though the Portuguese are able to establish ports along the African coast, they're not able to conquer Africa. They're not able to invade the interior of Africa for the reasons we stated before. Malaria was a push factor keeping them out, and also the fact that the African empires wouldn't let them. They had the same technology, okay? And so instead, they resign themselves, the Portuguese do, they resign themselves to establishing ports along the coast that they can then use to resupply as they make it to Asia. And then eventually, they're going to start the Asiento, which is the African slave trade. Okay, the slave trade from Africa to the Americas that Portugal is going to dominate. Okay. But the historical significance of all of this stuff that Henry the Navigator does, is that it is the catalyst for the age of exploration. Portugal does it first. They find the route to India, and then Spain is like, oh snap, we got to find a route too. But we can't go south, we can't go east, we can't go north, so we're going to go west. Thus, in 1492, resulting in the Europeans finding out about the New World. Are we good so far? So some of the explorers and expeditions that Henry the Navigator and Portugal funded included Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, And then following 1492, the exploration of the New World under Amerigo Vespucci. Okay, now Bartholomew Diaz was the first person that the Portuguese funded to find this maritime route to Asia, and he made it halfway there. He rounded the southern tip of Africa before his crowd mutinied and he had to go back to Portugal. So he makes it halfway there, but he never gets to complete that journey. After him, Vasco da Gama builds upon that route. He builds upon the route that Diaz had already set, and then he completes the other half of it, finally making it to the Indian Ocean. By that point, in 1498, the Spanish have already started building their maritime empire in the New World. So Portugal is going to focus a lot more heavily on Africa and not as much on the Americas. In fact, the colony that the Portuguese claim is Brazil, but then the Spanish get literally everything else in the New World. Okay, because they believe that their profits in Africa are going to surmount those found in America, which, spoiler alert, they're wrong. But due to finding this route to Asia, they're able to bring back Indian goods, creating a huge demand for those goods. Now, this is bad for Italy because Italy had been the European country with access to Asia. And as the only one with access to Asia, they were able to hold a monopoly. They were able to dominate that access. Now, they're not the only ones in town who can get to India. And so this hurts Italian profits. This hurts their economy. Okay, with the decline of their economy, that also hurts their government. All right, now we don't see an actual country of Italy develop until the 19th century. Okay, until the 1870s. Germany and Italy are the last countries to unify in Europe. So they're decentralized and they're fragmented. This could be one of the causes of that decentralization. They were doing well economically until they lost that monopoly, and now they're out of the game. So it's going to be another 400 years before they even become a country. They're just a bunch of different city-states and the Catholic Church. We good so far? Okay. Now, why are the American continents called the Americas? Well, it's because of this dude, Amerigo Vespucci, who the Portuguese sent to explore their colony in Brazil. Now, even though Pedro Cabral, a year prior to that, had brought up the fact that, hey, maybe South America is a new continent, maybe this isn't Asia, like Columbus thought at first, one of the map makers in Europe is going to say that Vespucci was the first one to declare this, and so that's how it's written down in history, which is why we're called the Americas instead of the Cabralians or something, okay, because of that incorrect fact being, or that incorrection being made, and then everyone just kind of going with it, okay? So that's what's significant about the Vespucci. Are we good so far? So speaking of the Portuguese Empire, they did not claim a lot of land in the New World. They left that up mostly to Spain. Okay, Spain is up there taking up all that land like, oh, it's free real estate, right? But the Portuguese are focused more on Africa for their profits. So they do claim some of the New World, but compared to Spain, a much smaller percent. So what kind of profit are the Portuguese getting out of Brazil? Well, it's primarily going to be cash crops. Remember, cash crops are crops that are grown for profit, not because you need them to live. So coffee, cotton, tobacco, but most importantly in Brazil, sugar plantations. And sugar plantations were incredibly deadly, okay, incredibly dangerous. And so there is a high mortality rate, a high death rate in these plantations for the people that were working on those plantations. Now, was it Europeans or indentured servants or serfs that were working on these plantations? No, okay? The Portuguese, rather than use native labor like the Encomienda, instead focused on their trading port empire in Africa and built upon the Asiento. Okay, so the natives were dying off from smallpox and other disease. The Portuguese owned the African slave trade known as the Asiento, and so they're going to start importing people stolen from the continent of Africa. Okay, so a high volume of people being brought over to the New World, but also a high mortality rate, which requires them to keep going back to Africa and demanding more people. Okay, as a result of the asiento, we're going to see a big change over time. Okay, a big change over time, a demographic change. So let's look at the Americas prior to exploration. Prior to exploration, this entire social hierarchy was made up of Native Americans and only Native Americans. Prior to 1492, there were no Europeans. There were no Africans. Okay, it was completely Aztec, Inca, Cahokians, Mississippian culture. It was all natives. What positions in society did the natives hold? All of them. The kings were Native American. The scribes were Native American. The slaves, the peasants, the merchants, the farmers, they were all the same race. They were all natives, the indigenous peoples. Okay, that changes with exploration. With exploration, a new hierarchy, instead of being based on status or what job you have, this new hierarchy known as the casta system is going to be based on race. Okay, casta system looks very familiar. It looks like the caste system in India. Again, the caste system in India developed as a racial hierarchy based on varna, or the color of someone's skin, with the Aryans of the Caucasus Mountains being higher in that social hierarchy than the native Dravidians, which were lower in that caste system. So we see something similar develop in the New World. So another change over time is who's in charge. It's no longer natives at the top of the hierarchy. Now it's Europeans. But there are two different classes of Europeans that emerge. You have the peninsulares. The key word in peninsulares is peninsula. This is referring to Europeans born in Europe, born in Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. They hold the most authority in the Americas. Underneath them are Creoles. Creoles are people of European descent, what we today would call Caucasian people, but they weren't born in Europe. They were born in the New World. So even though racially they are the exact same as the peninsulares, because of where they were born, they become second-class citizens. So the peninsulares hold the power. The Creoles are denied some of that power. And that's going to really tick the Creoles off and lead to some independence movements later in period 3. Okay, underneath the Europeans. Okay, so I'm just going to put European over here. You have the castas. Castas refers to the mixed races, and there are 3 categories of mixed races. The first are the mestizos. Mestizos are people of European descent and Native American descent. Okay, the majority population coming over to the New World from Spain and Portugal, there weren't a lot of women. The conquistadors, were there a lot of female conquistadors? No. Were there a lot of female explorers? No. Female captains of ships? No. Okay, then later when we get viceroys or governors in the New World, they are primarily made up of men. The judicial body, the audiencias, are made up of men. So you don't have a lot of women coming to the New World. Instead, you have a lot of European men. And those European men will have children with Native Americans and the African population in the New World, hence leading to this racial mixture. Okay, so you have European descent with Native American descent. That creates the class of mestizos. The second casta are the mulattoes. Okay, a historical term in this context, but not something that you use in the modern day. Okay, so this is only for use in period 2. Mulattoes is the mix between those of European descent and African descent. Okay, then third, the Zombos. These are people of African descent and Native American descent. Then at the bottom, underneath the Costas, are the indigenous, so the Native Americans, and then under them, the African population. What is this hierarchy based on? Is it based on money or title? No, it is based on race. Okay, so change over time. Native Americans are relegated to the bottom of society, whereas they used to control all of their society. And also you get new races introduced to the New World, whereas it had been completely 100% Native American prior to 1492. Now the Native American population is declining very rapidly, and instead you have a higher population of Europeans and Africans, okay, that have been forcibly imported. Are we good so far? Okay, so now we've talked about the Portuguese Empire. Let's talk about the Spanish Maritime Empire. So whereas the Portuguese have Brazil, okay, this area, the Spanish claim everything else. Okay, and this is due to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Basically, this is a line of demarcation drawn by the Pope and Portugal and Spain, saying everything in this direction beyond the line of demarcation is Spanish, and everything in this direction is Portuguese. So in order to prevent a war breaking out between the two foremost Catholic nations in Europe, the Pope got involved and was like, okay, the Portuguese get this. Now, why were the Portuguese okay with getting so little of the New World? Because they didn't think that the New World was going to make them as rich as their empire that they had built along Africa. So remember, they have this trading post Africa, trading post empire that gives them access to the Indian Ocean. Okay, so they bet that they're going to be able to get richer off of this. Spoiler alert, the Spanish get crazy rich off of the exploitation of the Americas. So the Portuguese made the wrong call there, but they are going to become very rich due to the asiento as well. Okay, so some of the justifications that were used for the expansion of the Spanish Empire included Christianity. Now, what type of Christianity were the Spanish interested in spreading? The Catholic, good. The Catholic religion. Okay, now at the same time, there is a religious schism happening in Europe. But wait, we already had a schism. We had the Great Schism in 1054. Well, that was between the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. Now we got a new one. In 1520, you have the Protestant Reformation. A monk by the name of Martin Luther in 1570 posted the 95 Theses, which was basically him throwing shade against the Catholic Church, saying that they were wrong. And we know that that's a big no-no. That is a heresy. Okay, so he is charged as a heretic, and he and his followers break off and form their own branch of Christianity known as Protestantism. So in Europe, you have literal wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, the Protestants who had been protesting what they considered to be Catholic corruption. If you've heard of the Puritans or Presbyterians or Methodists or Lutherans or Baptists, okay, Episcopalians, those are all Protestants that trace back to the Lutheran Church developing in the Protestant Reformation. So not only are the Spanish interested in keeping Europe 100% Catholic, they're fighting in Europe against the Protestants, they're also fighting to spread their faith in the New World, okay? But notably, in the New World, they can force conversions, okay, because of their military technology and their conquest of the Native Americans. But the other G in the three G's, other than God, is the desire for wealth, the desire for gold. That's also going to be a big motive behind exploration. Now, during this time, we see the rise of nationalism. Now, nationalism is different from patriotism. Patriotism is love of your country and respect for your country. The idea that your country is good or that it's great, right? Nationalism is the more extreme end of the spectrum there. Nationalism is when you think your country is the best or the greatest, and thus, by definition, everyone else is not as good. Everyone else is inferior. Okay, so that's going to lead to some problems, some moral issues. Spanish nationalism tells them that they are better than the Native Americans. And so that allows them to justify the genocide that's perpetrated against the Native Americans and the enslavement of the Native Americans. The Portuguese believe that they are superior to the African peoples. And so that's going to lead to the asiento. It's also going to lead to conflict within Europe as one nation goes against another nation for that same belief of, oh, hey, we're better than you. Right? In fact, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, the Nazi Party was nationalist. They believed that Germany and that Germans, specifically what they considered the Aryan race, were superior to all other peoples and all other races, thus culminating in the genocide of the Jewish population, the Roman population, those who are disabled, and the homosexual population, all thrown into camps under the idea of nationalism. Okay. Another motive behind exploration was finding a maritime route to Asia. Remember that the Portuguese found this route around Africa, and so the Spanish instead decided to go west. Instead of landing in Asia, they landed in the Caribbean. Okay. Now, as a result of all this gold and silver flooding into Spain, the Spanish are going to then use that gold and silver to buy stuff. Where do they want to buy stuff from? China. Remember, they want to get to Asia for a reason. And so China, inadvertently, even though China doesn't go in and conquer any of the New World, right? They're still going to profit off of exploration because they're selling stuff to the Spanish. Where are the Spanish getting money in order to buy Chinese stuff? They're getting it from the New World. So China gets a lot of that silver as a result. Good so far? Now, whereas the Portuguese funded Diaz and da Gama and Amerigo Vespucci, the Spanish are going to sponsor Columbus, which again in 1492 landed in the Caribbean, insisted that he had landed in India. Magellan, who was the first one to sail all the way around the world, although technically he died in the Philippines. He was killed because he had ticked off some natives. But his crew continued that circumnavigation. Y'all know that to navigate means to go places, and circum means circle. So he traveled around the world. He started in Portugal, right here, went around the tip of South America. There was no way to get through the Yucatan Peninsula, and there was no northwest passage that they could find. So they had to go around South America and made it to Asia by going west. Okay. Then once he gets to Asia, he continues through the Indian Ocean around the tip of Africa back to Spain. So he was the first, his crew was the first one to circumnavigate the world. Again, with conquistadors, remember that conquistadors are conquerors. We have the main ones, Cortez and Pizarro. In order to keep track of who conquered what, we use the mnemonic device MAC and PIP. Mexico, Aztec, Cortez. Cortez conquered Mexico after taking Montezuma, the leader of the Aztec, captive. Then in Peru, the Inca were captured by Pizarro. When he takes the leader Atahualpa hostage after Atahualpa already won the civil war against his brother in order to claim the throne, he demands a ransom in the form of an entire room being filled to the ceiling with gold and silver. Now, after he receives that ransom, Pizarro ends up killing Atahualpa anyway and taking over the Incan Empire. Okay, are we good so far? Do y'all see on this map how much of the New World was claimed by Spain? Okay, the lion's share. The Portuguese get Brazil. It is key that you remember that. All right, so now to go into more detail about the people sponsored by the Spanish Empire. First, obviously, we have to start with Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus has become a controversial historical figure where some people see him as an Italian leader founding the New World and being key to the discovery of the Americas, and other people see him as a genocidal person who committed atrocities against the Native Americans. Now, a lot of people use the argument of, oh, we can't judge historical figures in the past based on today's standards. Because, like today, yes, they'd get canceled, but things are different. Well, y'all, even back then, even back in 1492, Christopher Columbus was arrested and imprisoned for the atrocities that he committed in the New World. Ferdinand and Isabella, the people who paid for him to sail west in the first place, imprisoned him and stripped him of his governorship in the New World because of the things that were being reported that he was doing in the colonies. Okay, that included sharpening their swords on people. They would test their swords' sharpness by cutting off Native Americans' ears and noses and hands and feet. If the Native Americans didn't bring them their quota of gold and silver, okay, they would lose limbs. They would sick dogs on them to tear their stomachs open, or they'd cut their stomachs open and allow the dogs to eat their innards. Babies were fed to dogs. Children as young as the age of 9 were sold into slavery, including sexual slavery, right? Okay, so even by those standards, Christopher Columbus was judged by his contemporaries, by the king and queen, that he was being paid to work for, and he was stripped of that governorship. Okay, so how did all of this come to be? Well, Spain was trying to compete with Portugal. Portugal was finding a route to Asia and becoming wealthy, and so Spain decided to sail west. So they pay for Christopher Columbus and give him ships and supplies in order to sail west to see what he can find, thinking that he could find the route to Asia. Now, he claims that he lands in India, but he really landed in the Caribbean people and came into contact with the Taino people, who he called Indians because he was mistaken in thinking that he was actually in Asia. Now, after that first expedition, he goes back 3 more times to continue mapping Central America, still unto his deathbed, claiming that he had made it to India. All right, later we find out, obviously he's wrong. Amerigo Vespucci, Pedro Cabral are like, actually this is a whole new thing. But the historical significance of this expedition was that by bringing back knowledge of this new world, this led to the sponsorship of further expeditions. So Christopher Columbus wasn't the first and last person to go to the Americas. Once he comes back to Spain and the Europeans figure out, hey, this is in India, they start sending more people to the West. And they're not just sending explorers, they start sending conquistadors, conquerors. So this leads to the exploration of the New World, but also the domination of the New World by the European powers. First Spain and Portugal, and then eventually the French, the English, and the Dutch. Are we good? Now, not everybody in this time period, not all Europeans were pro-domination of the New World. There were some Europeans who protested against the ruthless treatment of the Native Americans, most notably Bartholomew de las Casas. Okay, he was a former conquistador. He was a conquistador, and his father had been an explorer that had actually gone with Christopher Columbus to the New World on his second voyage after 1492. Okay, so Bartholomew de las Casas was an eyewitness, a first account witness of what was going on in the New World. Now, we don't have a lot of records from the Native Americans or the enslaved peoples about what went on during that time period because they didn't have the platform in order to get that information out to the world. But as a European Catholic priest, Las Casas was interestingly positioned in order to give this firsthand account and spread it amongst the Europeans. He personally petitioned the Pope to intervene and to end the Encomienda system, which technically did get ended, but then it was just replaced with the hacienda system. So really, he failed to end the exploitation of the New World, but he did try to document it and get the Catholic Church involved. So his documentation was the book, A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. And remember, they called it Indies because they believed that they had landed in India. So he publicly criticizes what is going on in the New World. He is the source that we get this information about the enslavement of the Native Americans and the maltreatment of the Native Americans, them dying off from smallpox, but also dying of the cruelty that is imposed on them by the conquistadors. Okay, so he publishes this book and it gets spread around Europe, and it is used to condemn what is going on in the New World, particularly by the Protestants. Remember, the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants. They want to kill each other, right? And so the Protestants use this work by a Catholic priest as propaganda against the Catholics. This starts the quote unquote Black legend about how terrible Catholics are and how corrupt they are. It's used as evidence of, oh, look at what they're doing in the New World. They must be going to hell. They must be terrible. So they're like, oh, they're using Christianity. They are corrupting Christianity in order to make money, just like they've been doing in Europe with the indulgences. Okay, so they say, oh, the Spanish Catholics are using Christianity in order to justify the genocide of the Native Americans. What's hypocritical about this is that the Protestants do it too. When England starts colonizing the New World, do you think they're like, okay, we're going to treat the Native Americans as equals and be fair with them? No. So it's pretty hypocritical that even though the Protestant countries are like, Catholics, evil, because look, read the book, they are not going to apply that to themselves when they start colonizing. Okay. So not all Europeans were pro-colonization, but again, the people that were against the colonization were the minority. They are going to continue exploiting the New World for the rise of their golden age, particularly in Spain. Are we good so far? Okay. So Spanish explorers. Ferdinand Magellan is going to be the first to circumnavigate the globe, even though technically he dies in the Philippines along the way. That is going to increase knowledge of the Pacific Ocean, so it's going to help cartographers and map makers. The conquistadors, like we said before, the main ones are Cortes and Pizarro. Remember that they conquered the Aztec and the Inca. First, Cortes conquers the Aztec in 1521, then Pizarro conquers the Inca in 1532. So we see the fall of two mighty empires in the New World. There are some videos in the Schoology page on the Aztec and the Inca that I would highly recommend that y'all watch. Does anyone need this slide? Because it's all in the Cornell notes. Good? Okay, so the first video I would recommend you watch is the one about the Aztecs. Just as a recap, the Aztec are in Central America. Remember that their capital was Tenochtitlan in the swampy lake of Texcoco, where they had built their chinampas. But when Cortes takes over Tenochtitlan, he's going to reclaim it for Spain, and it becomes modern day Mexico City. Now, even though Cortes only had like 200 men with him, okay, how was he able to conquer an empire with a city that had almost 250,000 people? Well, even more so than the military technology that they had that gave them an advantage, the spread of smallpox is going to give them a huge advantage. Yeah, Elizabeth, that's the right reaction right there. You're just like, what? Okay, so this is a picture of someone fighting smallpox. It is a pox. You have pustules covering the entire body. So not just the face. And look how crowded they are, right? It's not just like, oh, you get a little rash. Okay, it's the entire body. And these pox were so severe that even people who survived it were often scarred for life. Okay, Queen Elizabeth I of England got smallpox. And it scarred her so badly that for the rest of her life, she would cake her face with heavy white makeup, which unfortunately, had a bunch of lead in it. So that could lead to, some lead poisoning and some later mental issues that she had later in her reign. But this is going to devastate the American population because they don't have an immunity. Okay, are y'all ready to move beyond this picture, or you want to stare at it some more? Okay, then with the Incas, we have Pizarro with Atahualpa. Again, the Incas were in Peru, which is in South America. The Incan road system of the Carpanon is going to be used by the conquistadors to lead them to the Incan capital that allows them to take over. And then the Spanish are going to change the mita system, or the form of labor where men ages 15 to 50 would work for the state, into the slavery system of the Encomienda. Good? So we had left off with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which, in addition to being something really fun to say, it is a treaty or an agreement between the major European powers involved in the initial conquest of the New World. Note that I said initial, so it's not just going to be Spain and Portugal that established colonies in the New World, but at the beginning, it's just them because they, called dibs, quote unquote. Right? So what's important to note about the Treaty of Tordesillas is who it included and who it excluded, right? So the main players in this treaty are Spain, Portugal, which, remember, they're a part of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Pope. Remember, Spain and Portugal are both Catholic. How Catholic? Super Catholic. Okay. Now, the Pope doesn't want these two Catholic nations fighting each other over who gets what in the New World. Okay, so this is going to be an agreement between those three players to peacefully divvy up the New World territory between those two countries. Okay, who did they not include in this treaty? Who do you think should have had a seat at the table there when it comes to dividing up the New World? Okay, not necessarily Africa, okay, because they're not colonizing Africa, remember, and Africa is also not colonizing anywhere in the New World. They're not exploring the New World. The Native Americans, good, TJ. Okay, so there had already been these mighty empires and already these peoples living in the New World. You have the Mississippian culture with the capital of Cahokia up here in the modern day United States. You have the Aztec in Mexico. You have the Inca in Peru. They were doing their own thing. And then you have Cortez and Pizarro and Columbus show up, and you've got all these conquistadors. And that's when things really went downhill for the Native Americans. Okay, so in dividing up the New World, they do not ask the Native Americans. They don't say, hey, are you willing to sell this to us? Or can we come to an agreement where, like, we get it on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, and y'all get it on Tuesday, Thursdays? Like, no, it's straight up, you're not even a part of this conversation, right? Which just shows the disdain that the Europeans had towards the Native Americans and the patronizing attitude of, oh, by conquering them, we're actually doing them a favor by, quote unquote, civilizing them and exposing them to Christianity. So Native Americans were not involved in this treaty. Okay, their power is taken away from them as colonial states. Also, they didn't ask any of the other European countries what they thought about divvying up the New World in this way. Because remember, England and the Netherlands and France, okay, they don't have any claim to the New World yet. Okay, so this is basically a monopoly on the New World and who gets what parts. Now, originally, the Pope is going to draw a line of demarcation right here, okay, which is going to give almost the entire New World to Spain, because everything to the left or the west of this red line belongs to Spain, and then everything to the right or the east of this line belongs to Portugal. But the original treaty only gave them this tiny little sliver of Brazil. That's going to change in 1494 when they move the line a little bit to the left, which gives more of Brazil, okay, to the Portuguese. So why is it that the Spanish got so much of this territory? Why didn't the Portuguese raise their hand and they're like, yeah, no, this definitely isn't 50-50. We want more of this land. Well, because the Portuguese erroneously believed that they would make more money focusing on Africa, but not the colonization of Africa, remember, because the Europeans couldn't colonize Africa, but instead on their trading port empire, using the western coast of Africa to get to Asia. Okay, because what was in Asia that everyone wanted to get to? Not Coachella. Spice trade. Good, TJ. Okay, so they find this route with Vasco da Gama. They have access to the spice trade. That makes them crazy rich. They start enslaving African peoples along the western coast and importing them into their colony in Brazil to grow cash crops like sugar. That makes them rich. And also, they're making a lot of money off of the slave trade in general. So, even though Spain gets all of this territory, and that seems really unfair for Portugal. Portugal was like, yeah, no, we don't really think that there's going to be a lot of money making opportunities in the new world. We're just going to stick with our colony in Brazil and we're going to stick with focusing on Asia. But also, they copyrighted the Asiento. They were granted exclusive rights to the African slave trade. So they're saying, hey, Spanish, you can't come in and start buying slaves in Africa. Okay. If you want people from Africa, then you're going to have to buy them from us. So basically, creating a monopoly on the African slave trade. Now, the Portuguese aren't going to hold the Asiento forever. Eventually, the Netherlands, the Dutch, take it away from them, and they also take away the spice trade from them with their Dutch East Indies Company, and then eventually the English, okay, come in and take over the Asiento with their British East Indies Company, or British East India Company. Okay, so what you need to know about the Treaty of Tordesillas is, number one, who is involved and who wasn't involved, because that's important. And then number two, who got what? Spain got almost everything in the New World, with the exception of Brazil. Portugal got Africa, the route to Asia, and the Asiento. And so when I try to think of who controlled what in the New World, at first, it's going to be mostly Spain, but eventually the English and the Dutch and the French start getting involved. So I start thinking about the languages of those areas. What language is predominantly spoken in Mexico? Spanish. So that would lead me to believe, hey, maybe it was Spain that conquered Mexico. What about in Peru and Colombia and Venezuela, all these areas in Latin America? Also Spanish, which makes sense that it culturally diffused from Europeans in Spain. Okay, the Aztec weren't speaking Spanish, and the Inca weren't speaking Spanish. They were speaking Quechua, right? And so it culturally diffused over due to conquest. What about in Brazil? What language do they speak in Brazil predominantly? Portuguese, which makes sense because they were a colony of Portugal. What about in the modern United States? What was the original mother country of the United States? England. So the majority language in the United States is English. Okay, what about in Canada? What languages do they speak? French and English. Good. So the French first come in and claim areas of Canada like Quebec, and then eventually the English take that territory from them. Okay, so if you ever get confused about who was the mother country of that colony or the other colony, think of what language they speak, and that's going to pretty accurately trace you back to whoever the mother country is. Okay, are we good on Treaty of Tordesillas? Okay, so here's just a close-up of the map showing you the original line of demarcation, and this yellow line eventually gets moved further to the west to give more of Brazil to Portugal. But I want you to note how tiny Portugal is, y'all. Portugal is this tiny little empire in Europe, and then all of a sudden they start controlling a whole western coast to Asia and Brazil. They're going to have too small of a population and too little manpower to be able to successfully maintain that empire. That's when the Dutch come in and take it from it. And then eventually the English come in and take it from the Dutch. So the Spanish Empire is going to be a lot more extensive, and it's going to last a lot longer than the Portuguese Empire, even though the Portuguese technically got started first with Henry the Navigator funding expeditions around Africa to get to Asia. Okay, does that make sense so far? All right. So when we talk about historical thinking skills in this time period, we've already talked about causation in terms of, what were the causes and the effects of imperialism. The 3 Gs were causes: God, gold, and glory. The effects were mostly negative demographic effects for the New World, negative demographic effects for Africa, positive economic effects for Europe. Okay, we can go on and on about being specific with that. So now let's look at another historical thinking skill of continuity and change. Now, which one do you think is going to be the easier part of this historical thinking skill to argue? Do you think there's more change or more continuity during this time period? Oh yeah, definitely, TJ. A lot of change as we go from period 1 to period 2. Okay, there's a whole change in that they find a whole new hemisphere. Okay, all this land that they didn't know existed. Okay, so definitely change is going to be the easier one to argue rather than continuity. Okay, so what are some political changes that old imperialism wrought upon the New World? Well, number one, the Americas are no longer controlled by Native American governments. Okay, do y'all know any Native American leaders or titles of leaders that we've talked about so far? Whew. They can be the names. Good. The Great Sun. That's a title. The Great Sun with the Mississippian population in North America. Okay. The Great Speaker with the Aztec, who's a representative of the gods. Okay. You have Pachacuti, the founder of the Incan Empire. You have Montezuma, the last emperor of the Aztec, Atahualpa, the last leader of the Inca. Okay, all of these people are Native American. This is prior to old imperialism. What about after old imperialism? You don't have Native American kings and emperors anymore. Instead, you have peninsulares, which are Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. You have the viceroys, who are Spanish governors. You have the audiencias, which are Spanish judges. You have the conquistadors. And do y'all know any names of any conquistadors? Cortez, who conquered the Aztec, and Pizarro, who conquered the Inca. Good. So you see a change over time from Native Americans being in charge to Europeans being in charge in the New World. Okay, now politically, how did they divide up the New World? Through the Treaty of Tordesillas. So also a change over time in Europe. The Europeans finally get a golden age. Spain enters into its golden century. That's a big change over time. They go from having this land here. Let me change my pen. They go from having this much land to this much land. Okay, with Portugal, they go from having, stop it. I'm trying to make it a different color. It's not working. They go from having this much land here to this much land. Okay, that's a change over time. The expansion of their borders to a maritime empire. So they're no longer just a land empire. Now they are a maritime empire. They have more clout. They have more power. They have more money. Okay, all those are political changes brought on by old imperialism. All right. Like the Incan Empire, once the Spanish Empire gets too big, it has to be divided up into smaller parts. And so the Spanish are going to divide their empire into 4 parts, into 4 viceroyalities. Think of a viceroyalty as a state. And at the head of each state, they have a governor, just like the United States is divided into 50 states, and we have our own governor, Kay Ivey, with the executive branch, right? Well, that governor, known as a viceroy for the Spanish, the viceroy is in charge of the viceroyalities, okay, the state. You can call it viceroy if you want, it's a written test. They are supposed to represent the will of the king. But in theory, that sounds good. But in actuality, how far away is the king from Mexico? Pretty far. It might take months. If you want to ask the king, hey, I need some advice on what crop to grow next year, and you send him a letter, it could take months for you to get a response, or the king could leave you on red, right? And so the viceroys are really the main power in the New World. And they're going to start saying things that are law by the king, but instead they're just corrupt. They're just ruling as they want to rule because the king is an entire ocean away. Okay, so in theory, they're supposed to represent the king, but they end up kind of, taking some of that power for themselves. They're not the only ones, though, that are supposed to be maintaining order in the New World. You also have the audiencias, which are the judicial branch of the New World. This is 12 to 15 judges that are supposed to help the viceroy rule. So let's say someone breaks a law, okay, they would go before the judges to see what the punishment was. Okay, so you have an executive branch and a judicial branch in the New World. But remember, these governors aren't supposed to be making themselves rich. They're not supposed to be collecting the gold and silver and cash crops for themselves because they are the governor of a colony. They're supposed to send it back to the mother country because they're under mercantilism. They're supposed to take all this gold and silver and cash crops and send it back to Spain. Okay, but are they going to start becoming corrupt and skimming a little off the top and keeping some of that gold and silver for themselves? Yes, they are. Okay, but 1/5 of all the metals, all the gold and silver that make it to Europe, 20% goes directly to the king and the queen. So they're going to become crazy rich. Okay, but don't say that in your essay. Make it AP. Are we good so far? Okay, Spanish exploration and conquest relied very heavily on silver, even more so than gold, because there's more silver in the New World than gold. But again, unlike with the continent of Africa, the Spanish can go in and conquer large swaths of land in the New World and subjugate or dominate their populations for slave labor in the Encomienda. Like we said before, the empire was divided into 4 states or viceroyalities, with each of them led by a governor known as the viceroy. Also ruling with them were the audiencias, who served as the judges and jury in the New World. But again, these governors did not rule the area for themselves. They reported back to the king and the queen, because the purpose of the colonies is to make the mother country rich. And primarily that's going to be through gold and silver, but eventually that's going to shift over to cash crops, which is going to lead to the increase in coerced labor, first with the encomienda and then with the asiento. Okay, remember that the Americas produced raw goods, okay, crops. Those crops would then be sent in that third leg of the triangular trade back to Europe, where the Europeans would manufacture them. So raw goods like sugar would go to Europe and be manufactured into alcohol, which would then be sold in Africa in exchange for slaves, which would lead to the Middle Passage, right? They also would ban their colonies from selling those goods to other European countries. Let's say France hits up a viceroy and says, hey, I want to buy some sugar from you and I'll give you $100 million, right? Well, no, you can't sell that sugar to the French. You have to give it to the king and the queen, okay? Because under mercantilism, you're not supposed to make yourself wealthy, that's capitalism. It's not individuals. Okay, it is the country as a whole. So they would prevent competition from emerging in the New World. They said, no, you have to give your goods to us. Again, like we said before, the encomienda is a coercive labor system first used to enslave the Native Americans. At first, it was supposed to be mutually beneficial. They tried to create the encomienda to be like the feudalistic system. But remember, even the feudal system in Europe stopped being beneficial to both sides. It started benefiting one group of people over the other. Okay, so with the spread of the work by Bartholomew de las Casas, the Spanish government and the Catholic Church did try to rein in the encomienda system from savagely exploiting the Native Americans, but that reining in didn't really work like it was supposed to. Okay, the idea was that the Native Americans were supposed to work for the Spanish for like 6 days out of the week, and then they'd get a day off to work on their own land. Okay, so the Europeans thought that they were doing them a favor, that they were civilizing them. They said, oh, look at these backwards Native Americans. They don't know about the ownership of land. They share it with the community. That's not how it's supposed to work. They don't know about Jesus. We're going to save their souls, right? We're going to protect them. So it was seen as if the Europeans were doing a favor to the Native Americans. Okay, that's how they justified this exploitation, and that the Native Americans would become civilized and they would work for the Spanish settlers first, and then they could work a little bit for themselves on their day off. But in reality, it becomes a slave system. Okay, Native Americans die off from disease and conquest and extremely poor treatment. And so their population, as well as their culture, is almost completely wiped out. Now, the Catholic Church does end the encomienda, but then it just pops up by different names, like the hacienda and the repartimiento. Okay, so we still see that exploitation. Eventually, the Spanish Empire is going to move away from the encomienda and towards the asiento as the native population decreases, because the encomienda is notorious for brutality and harsh living conditions. Now, this chart is available in Schoology. I have that under our lecture series, so if you want to add that to your Cornell notes, that's available there.